Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jack Rakove. I'm an emeritus professor of history and political science at Stanford University, and I'm here to introduce a conversation that will run as long as an hour with my colleague John Ragosta, who's a historian stationed in Monticello, Jefferson's home. The subject of our conversation is John's new book, which I'm putting up here, For the People, for the Country, Patrick Henry's Final Political Battle. It pivots mostly on really the last year or two of Henry's life, with the kind of dramatic conclusion being his reaction to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions and the dramatic political conflict that broke out in the United States in 1798 and 1799. There's a kind of final dramatic scene in which George Washington writes Henry to try to re-enlist him in a struggle to save the Republic from the vicious factionalism that had been raging, throughout the 1790s, but particularly during President John Adams' administration. That's all I'll say about introduction. I think John wants to say a quick hello himself, and then we'll cut to the chase.
Well, thank you, Jack. Yeah, and I really appreciate your being here today. I appreciate the National Archives. It is, you mentioned Washington writing Henry. That's actually how I got started on this project. I came across that letter doing some other research, and it was just, I knew nothing about it. I had a PhD in American history, but here's George Washington in 1799 begging Patrick Henry to come out of retirement to save the nation. And that's what launched this book.
So let me start by asking, as I was reading your book, it reminded me of, actually, I think the first book I read for a colleague after I finished graduate school was Pauline Mayer's second book, The Old Revolutionaries. Pauline was an old and good friend of mine going back to my graduate school days. Pauline took characters like Samuel Adams, Richard Henry Lee, Charles Carroll, one or two others figured her story. And it occurred to me reading your book that Patrick Henry would fall within that category. When she said old revolutionary, she meant members of the revolutionary generation who had played prominent roles, but somehow did not have quite the same éclat, quite the same stature as the so-called Big Six. And when scholars talk about Big Six, we mean Washington, John Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, and Hamilton. They dominate. Then you have a number of other people like John Dickinson is one, John Jay would be another, and other names familiar to scholars. Henry, of course, is a famous name, but in terms of how he's portrayed, he hasn't quite cracked the top level. And so I wondered, John, just in terms of your interest and fascination with Henry, I mean, what makes him so attractive a figure to you, and what drove you to write this book and to become in effect a Henry scholar?
Well, Jack, it's fascinating because I just finished an article which is going to come out next year about Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson's relationship. And I was talking about Henry as a forgotten founder, and one of the readers said, well, there's all of these fellows, John Jay, Dickinson, they're all, forgotten founder. Why is Henry any different from these other second tier kind of people? And one aspect, this sort of gets really to the appendix of the book, or the epilogue of the book. Unlike some of these others, there was a real campaign by the Jeffersonians to keep Henry's reputation down and to destroy Henry's reputation because of Jefferson's dislike of Henry and because of what's at the center of this book. When Henry comes out against the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions and what I view as a radical states' rights doctrine, I think Madison and Jefferson came to see it as a radical states' rights doctrine, he becomes an anathema. And so the epilogue ends with, Edward Pollard, the famous lost cause, unrepentant Confederate, trashing Patrick Henry. So he is on this sort of second tier. He's not one of the Big Six, as you say, but I think he's more important than perhaps some of the others. And the other aspect, you mentioned everyone's heard of Patrick Henry. I'm not sure everyone's heard of John Dickinson or John Jay. Everyone's heard of Patrick Henry. The only thing they know about Patrick Henry, 7 words: give me liberty or give me death. And not only do I think that's inadequate, I think it really misrepresents Henry. And it's been taken on by the Tea Party and by some of the 3%ers and so on, and really misrepresents Henry's history.
Yeah. I'm well known as a Madisonian, and I had actually thought I'd said about as much as I had to say about Madison a few years ago, and I discovered that's wrong. I'm still coming up with new ways to think about him. I'm drawn to Madison because I think he's I think the most sophisticated political theorist of the revolutionary generation. As my mentor Bernard Bailey would say, bar none. But one of the themes you develop in your book is to try to contrast the public Henry we recall as the firebrand, the give me liberty, give me death guy, versus Henry as a kind of political philosopher. And I won't say I stumbled over that, but it would be interesting to hear to hear you characterize how you think of Henry as a political philosopher. What you mean by using that term, how you would flesh it out, what are the core tenets? I mean, I could talk forever about Madison's political philosophy, but I'm not sure. At first pass, I'm not sure what I'd say about it, beyond being an anti-federalist in 1788. So when you call Henry a political philosopher, what do you mean by that?
Well, by the way, I want to come back to Madison because I think there's something new here about Madison. Henry is dismissed by Jefferson as he's just Jefferson doesn't use the term demagogue, but he's just a speechifier. All he is an orator, and he's really good at that, Jefferson concedes. But I think that Henry, his political philosophy, which is really significant, is very much a localism, but not a parochialism. It's a localism is the people need to govern themselves. And if the people decide to do this, so the one example I would take from the book that he does several times, you had mentioned he was the great Antifederalist. He led the opposition to ratification of the Constitution. But when he realizes the Constitution is going to be ratified, he says on a couple of occasions, if that's what the people want, I lost. I'm going to continue to seek change, but I will do it in a constitutional way. So he has a very visceral commitment to the power of the people to govern, and that we have to abide by that. Now, I think there is a localism. He's accused of by a lot of people. I shouldn't say accused. He's characterized as being very localist, very Virginian, and I think that's true to an extent. But he certainly appreciates that the people ratified the Constitution and that we have a union.
Yeah, but John, look, I could go back and say if there are a lot of ways to characterize Jefferson as a political philosopher. I mean, in my book Revolutionaries, I argued that his notions of equality beyond the preamble of the Declaration are actually fairly sophisticated and complicated. But as you were just saying about Henry, a lot of commentators have said that Jefferson, as a democratic theorist, also believed in the idea of ward republics. I mean, he did. I mean, in fact, it's when that guy Richard Matthews, wrote that book about Jefferson, which says in some ways that was the core tenet. That was the core tenet of Jefferson's ideal political philosophy, to kind of reconstruct Republican government from the community up, maybe thinking the Anglo-Saxon hundreds or whatever. But if I said that would make Henry and Jefferson seem fairly close ideologically, no?
Absolutely. I think, Peter Onuf has mentioned that as well in his Four Virginians book, that as much as they hated each other for personal reasons, Jefferson and Henry are actually much closer, I think, politically. Now, he's not a Madison, and he's probably not even a Jefferson. I should have said that. Madison certainly is a great theorist. He's a great thinker. Jefferson is a thinker as well. He tends to react more than a Madison does. He tends to emote more than a Madison does. And I don't want to suggest that Henry is equivalent to a Madison, but I do think he's been shortchanged. And I think your point about Jefferson and Henry sharing very much this view of the local right to govern is very much true.
Mm-hmm. So how do you, it might be good for our audience if we spend a few minutes blocking out Henry's career. I mean, there is the pre-1776 period, and then he goes back to Virginia. And though, it seems to me that if you look at state politics during the Revolution proper, meaning from the mid-1770s to the mid-1780s, there are three preeminent figures in state politics. I'd say in Massachusetts, John Hancock, in New York, George Clinton, and Virginia, Patrick Henry, both during his 3 years as governor until he was term limited out the way Madison was term limited out of the Continental Congress. And then, of course, off and on, in the 1780s. But maybe, it might be useful if we give our listeners, a bit more, since we don't want to reduce Henry to just being the firebrand. I mean, how you see the arc of Henry's political career unfolding.
Yeah, no, it's a good point because it's so easy to miss. And it's perhaps the first clue that Henry may be more significant politically than he's been given credit. He is the first governor of Virginia, of the independent state of Virginia. He's governor for 3 years. There's talk about giving him a 4th year, even though the Constitution of Virginia says 3 years. And he actually says, no, that's not right. He becomes the leading legislator, so much so that when Washington and Madison are concerned about Henry's influence as an anti-Federalist, Washington, I believe, writes a letter. He says, Henry merely needs to say, let it be, and it is so. He is dominant in the Virginia legislature. When John Randolph of Roanoke says that if Henry had been elected, if Henry had lived in 1799, Jefferson would not have been president. That was because of an electoral college vote that swung on 5 votes. And Randolph says Henry was good for 5 times 5 votes any day of the week in the Virginia legislature. So he's dominant in the Virginia legislature. And then he's elected again for 2 terms in the 1780s. He's elected again in the 1790s as governor. And at that point, he's retired and he says, no, he turns it down. He's already been elected, but he turns down the governorship. He becomes the leading anti-Federalist in 1788 at the Virginia Ratification Convention. But then he retires in 1790. And between the ratification and retiring, he leads Virginia's opposition to Alexander Hamilton's financial program. Virginia does protest and say Hamilton's gone too far. The assumption of state debts is unconstitutional. He leads that. But then he steps back. And this is one of the reasons why he's not so well known. He was offered Secretary of State. He's offered Supreme Court Justice. He's offered Ambassador to France. He's offered Senator. He's offered Ambassador to Spain. He says no. And it's sort of curious. I don't know exactly why he's saying no. He has 17 children, and he's trying to, he's busy. And when he dies, there's a 2-year-old. He's trying to make sure that all of his sons have plantations. So he's trying to earn money. He had opposed the government. So he does say, look, it's your government. You ratified the Constitution. You all run it. But he is the most popular politician in Virginia from 1775 to 1799, bar Washington.
Right. But okay, so John, let me just push on this a little bit further. So how would you account for his popularity? Which is, it's a tough question to ask, and it's not like asking about a contemporary politician today. How we source this and think about this, I think might be more challenging. But if you make this claim, what do what's the foundation on which it rests?
I think he's much more an everyman than either Washington or Jefferson or Madison. That people liked him. I mean, he started out. You mentioned his career during the Revolution. I mean, he started out running a store. And he kept failing running the store because people would come in and he'd start talking to them, and then he'd give them, he'd give them stuff on credit, and then he'd never collect. He tried to run a plantation, and that failed, And so I think he has this. And Jefferson, who's very much, as you mentioned earlier, a Democrat and believes in politically the equality, but everybody understands sort of Jefferson's up there. Washington's up there. I remember Gouverneur Morris giving Washington a hug, and everybody thinking that's crazy. Yeah. Henry's the guy he's your next door neighbor. And people seem to get that he seems to speak for them. So we don't have surveys, we don't have polling places, but he's extraordinarily popular. And as Washington and Madison say, he absolutely dominated the Virginia legislature.
Right. What do you think are the best accounts of Henry's oratorical skills? I mean, everyone says they were formidable. My sense is the Virginia Convention, on any given the ratification convention, that Henry, on the one hand, he's a dominant figure. On the other hand, he seems to irritate a lot of the other anti-federalists because he won't keep to a system. I mean, George Mason who was, I guess, was pretty much his leading ally at the convention, wanted to go through the Constitution kind of point by point, and Henry is just, once he's on a rhetorical roll, there's no stopping him.
Now he builds up a head of steam, and he goes. I mean, we ought to understand 18th century oratory is different from modern oratory.
Right.
We would view it, if we heard Patrick Henry, completely overdone, completely overdramatic. Undoubtedly, that's all true. But it is astounding. Everyone who had heard him, people like Jefferson, who is not a Henry fan, says he seems to me to speak as Homer wrote. It's extraordinary. Edmund Randolph says at one point, someone asks him about Patrick Henry's oratory, and he picks up a piece of charcoal from a fireplace, and he says, I might as well draw the lightning in the sky with this charcoal as try to describe Henry's oratory. But it's clearly melodramatic, give me liberty or give me death. And he takes a letter opener and plunges it into, his chest. Boy, I don't want to make too many modern comparisons, but so I just had a terrible modern comparison come flash into my mind. But people felt like, yeah, he's speaking for me when he says, we've got to have liberty, we've got to support, we've got to do something about freedom. And sometimes that oratory is not pretty. I mean, you mentioned the ratification conventions. He gets into slavery at the ratification convention and fairly ugly. But people hear him.
I think this actually ties in with the militia issue, and thus if I remember correctly, and I've done a lot of work on the Second Amendment. But let me look, John. Here's a thought that just popped in my head. It's a term that I think we overuse and to some extent abuse in our modern political analysis, but using it somewhat neutrally. Do you think it'd be fair to say Henry was our first populist politician in some kind of generic? I mean, I always think of populism as a specific political movement, and then how do you compare that to contemporary events? I have problems with those kinds of analogies. But in a more general sense, populist, aligning with popular.
Right. I've been criticized for describing him as a populist, but I think he is. And as you say, we have to be careful because modern connotation is a little bit different. But he very much sees himself, and Jefferson criticizes him for this, saying, he likes going out hunting with the guys, and he likes going and drinking, and the answer is, yeah, he did. And people saw him. Actually, Jefferson criticizes John Marshall for the same thing, that he saw Marshall as a little bit plebeian in his tastes. So yeah, I do think he's a populist in the broad sense of he felt and he saw his role as trying to reflect for the people what they needed to do. And there's some ways that an example that just jumped to mind. He's very much involved as a leader in the Virginia legislature with what to do about the Native American issue, because they're struggling with what to do about Native Americans. Well, and they're struggling with what to do about Tories from the American Revolution. And he has this very inclusive sense of, no, look, we're all here together. We're all working together. So he actually proposes at one point, it's not adopted. He says, if a Native American marries somebody of European descent, the state ought to give them $50 because we want to encourage people to be part of the community. When the question after the revolution becomes, should the Tories be allowed back into the country? And people were afraid, no, we shouldn't let it. They're dangerous. They opposed us in the revolution. And Henry gives this speech. He says, I can't remember the exact terms, but we conquered the lion. Why should we be concerned about his whelps? The British lion. So no, everybody should be here. Everybody should be part of the country. We're an expanding country. So yeah, he has this very broad sense of the people and people's right to participate.
Good. Okay, so I think it's a good time. We're about 20 minutes into our 45-minute to an hour discussion. It's probably a good time to shift gears. So, in terms of the dramatic structure of your book, it kind of culminates in the, dramatic sense in the Washington Henry interchange and Henry's last speech and so on. But I think the pivot really is thinking about 1798. And part of the pivot is the severity of the international crisis the United States faces during the so-called quasi-war period, against France on the one hand, and then of course another part of it pivots on what the Republican leaders, meaning Jefferson and James Madison, are doing, particularly the Virginia Kentucky resolutions, but then broader questions of their political strategy looking ahead to 1800. And since I'm not sure I agree with everything that you say here, which is fine, but I think why don't we start by reframing or framing the issues of 17, let's say the whole 1798 1800 period as you see them, and then we can go ahead and talk in more detail about the critical aspects of it.
Right. Well, and I think you're right. 1798 is critical. We're aware that there's tension in Europe. The wars are going on in Europe, and the United States is trying to stay out of them. And people are vaguely aware that we had this thing called the Alien and Sedition Act. But one of the things that surprised me in doing this research is, like most people, I'd heard of the Alien and Sedition Act, but the conventional wisdom was 14 people had been prosecuted. Which, that's bad, but 14 people. More recent research, people like Wendell Bird and others have shown there were scores of people prosecuted, and it's specifically targeted at Democratic Republican newspaper editors. So that's why Jefferson talks about a reign of witches. It's not 14 prosecutions, it's over 100 people are indicted. And they're targeting, they're trying to silence political opposition. So that was sort of my first realization and revelation, is that the crisis of 1798 for Jefferson and Madison was much more real than perhaps we've given it credit. And I think they're desperate. I think they see their supporters going to jail and being prosecuted. And they're wondering, how can we have a fair election if our newspaper editors are thrown in jail? So that's sort of the first.
Okay, so John, let me just say, I want you to subject. So you're working definite. I mean, desperate is the term you use.
Yeah.
So your working definition of desperation here means that
they are concerned that the political process will not work.
Okay.
That if you don't have, and very modern implication, if you don't have a free press, if you don't have people's ability to criticize the government, how can you have a fair election?
Right.
So
let me just say for all the listeners out there. So John is referring to primarily, but not solely, to a wonderful book by Wendell Bird, which I reviewed in the American Historical Review, and my copy is literally back here over my shoulder. Which is a very powerful book. It's fair in some ways. It's a very schematic book in terms of how it's designed. There's a kind of template for how he treats things. But one of the telling things about it is that, in addition to describing how all these individual prosecutions originated, the particular calculations that went into them, Bird provides these very telling stories about what happened to the individual printers and their families. And these guys were dependent on their livings, and the way the Federalists went after them really kind of literally devastated and destroyed some families. I mean, really drove them to the brink of impoverishment. It's not just the guys who are going to jail, but families are literally being driven into poverty. So desperate. I mean, pushing on desperation is a way of kind of developing what that meant operationally or consequentially.
Right, and that's why people have heard perhaps they've heard Jefferson's reign of witches quote. That quote pops up all the time.
Right.
I don't think I'd fully appreciated. It was a reign of witches if you were a Democratic Republican, if you were a newspaper editor. And as you say, these people's lives were being destroyed.
Okay, so shouldn't this make you a Jeffersonian and a Madisonian like me, or what?
Well, the interesting thing is I've told a number of people, this book took a lot longer to write than I would have liked in multiple respects.
That's true of most books.
That's true of most books. Had I finished it 5 years earlier, Jefferson and Madison would have come out much worse. I really developed a much greater appreciation for the reign of witches. And then I'll get to the third, because I think it happens in 3 stages.
Mm-hmm.
The middle then is their reaction, which is the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, in which Jefferson's actually using the term nullification,
right.
That an individual state should be allowed to nullify the federal government's laws. We have a compact among independent sovereign states. Madison's Virginia resolutions are, of course, much more mild.
More tempered, yeah.
More tempered. But that's what brings Washington out saying, we have a crisis. We're about to have a civil war, because if we're going to have state against state, if the laws are going to be different state by state. And then the third piece, which gets us back to Madison, I said I wanted to come back to Madison at some point. I also believe, and I think this is relatively new, that there is a very conscious retrenchment on the part of Jefferson and Madison, that they realized that they had been hyper-partisan and they'd gone too far. So when Madison, within 10 days of the Virginia resolutions being adopted, he wrote them. And he's writing Jefferson within 10 days saying, you know, maybe we went too far. And if the Virginia resolutions went too far, the Kentucky resolutions, which are much more aggressive, you know, talking about nullification, laws are null, void, of no force and effect. Federal laws are null, void, no. So I think that Madison and Jefferson realize, and I think this is a much better explanation for the election of 1800 and Jefferson's presidency, that they really do pull back and realize the hyper-partisanship. No, Henry dies in 1799, Washington dies, but Jefferson and Madison are left in the presidency and the Secretary of State. And I think they realize how fragile the nation really was, and that maybe things had gone too far.
Yeah. I mean, John, based on what you're saying, I might have to give this some rethinking myself. I mean, my reading, let's have a little exchange between us, and then listeners can see how scholars disagree. Is my reading is Madison from the start is reacting against Jefferson in a not atypical way. You know, after Jefferson died, Madison has a wonderful line. To forget who was the recipient of this letter, he says that when dealing with Jefferson, one has to make allowance, as in common with men of great genius. I'm blanking on the phrase, but you know, basically Jefferson. You know, Jefferson was, I call it Jefferson, I think, the streak hitter. You're kind of an impulsive speaker, and Madison, you know, on repeated occasion says, you know, you're really going too far here, and you really have to. You know, Madison's phrase of expressing in strong and round terms the impressions of the moment.
Right.
Okay, I'm 76 years old, so occasionally I lose a grip on
no.
Too. But so my reading of this was always that you know, Madison's. I always took Madison's position in 1798 to be that the Republicans have run out of effective political options. They don't have the presidency. They don't have either house of Congress. They don't have the judiciary. Their only recourse is to the states, and they want to say that the states must have some residual authority as political actors, based on being the original compacting parties, to play some residual role in, at least in voicing political dissent. Jefferson, by flirting with nullification, goes, you know, not just a bridge too far, but several bridges too far. But Madison really calls him back on this.
Right. Yeah. But I think that, and you're right, getting into, I should never, you know, get into this with a Madisonian, but because when Jefferson sees Madison's draft of the Virginia resolutions, he tries to insert the phrase null, void, of no force and effect, which was the language from the Kentucky resolution, federal law. And to those listening, I'm speaking in shorthand. What they're saying is the state is saying that the federal law is null, void, of no force and effect. And Jefferson tries to insert that into the Virginia, and neither of them's in the Virginia legislature. They're working through surrogates. So Madison's drafted it. Madison finds out that they're trying to insert that language, and he has it pulled back out. He says, no, that goes too far. Madison's talking about states, plural, right to intervene. Jefferson's talking about a state has the ability to intervene. So yeah, I think Madison is pulling back on Jefferson from the start, as he does so often in his career. He's very often saying, you know, Tom, maybe you've gone too far here. Right. But even with that letter from December of 1799, where even though the null, void, no force and effect language has already been removed, Madison says, you know, we may have gone too far in the act of protesting the federal government's usurpation of our rights, the First Amendment right to free press. We might be accused of usurping federal authority, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, federal authority by the states. So you are absolutely correct. I mean, Madison was certainly trying to keep Jefferson within limits from the start, but I think he even pulled back a little bit from his own language and said, we really need to be cautious here. And then this comes up through the nullification crisis. As you all know, Jefferson dies in 1826. In 1828 and into the 1830s, the nullification crisis, the South Carolina nullifiers, the fire breathers, are all quoting Jefferson and Madison's Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And Madison is trying to say over and over again, that's not what we meant. That's not what we meant. We didn't say that. Well, actually, Mr. Madison, Jefferson did say that. Madison is trying to, I think, recharacterize some of Jefferson's language from '98. Okay. But I think Jefferson pulls back as well. I think Jefferson's inaugural address, again, everybody's familiar with the line, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. When I went back and reread that address, I think it's much richer, and it's evidence of Jefferson really realizing this hyper-partisanship almost drove the country over the edge. He says at one point, I understand why the Federalists were concerned that France might invade. That's an extraordinary, 1798 Jefferson does not say that. 1800.
So John, now our viewers, as well as your colloquitor here, want to know, okay, now how are we going to plug your buddy Patrick Henry back into this story?
Well, what's interesting is Henry, what we've not talked about, and you mentioned it as sort of the pivot in the book, is Henry's final political speech, March 4th, 1799, Charlotte Courthouse. It's a relatively well-recorded Henry speech because,
what was the occasion?
He's running for legislature. Washington says, please come back into politics, run for Congress. We need you in Congress to stop this hyper-partisanship, to respond to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And Henry is ill. We know he's going to die in 4 months. He's probably feeling some of these symptoms. And he says, I can't do that, but I will go to Richmond because Virginia's the problem. I will deal with the Virginia legislature. So he's running for Virginia House of Delegates. And he comes on March 4th, Charlotte Courthouse. And people the reports are there are thousands of people because everybody knows this is going to be, they know the guy's getting old. They know he's been ill. This is going to be Patrick Henry's final public speech, perhaps. Students from colleges 20 miles away are walking to, the tavern to hear Patrick Henry speak that morning. Well, he gets up and he gives this, it's pure Henry. What's happened has planted thorns upon my pillow. He uses this language that people understand. And, my favorite for the oratory, and then we'll come back to some substance. At one point he says, if Virginia keeps going down this route, it's going to face George Washington leading a federal army into Virginia to put down Virginia. And who would dare lift an arm against the man who led them in battle? Well, there's a drunk there because it's an 18th century election. People have been drinking. And we actually know the guy's name. Henry turns on him and just towers on him. You dare not do it. In such a parricidal attempt, the steel would drop from your nerveless arm. This is just Henry. This is beautiful. But where he ends the speech, and I think this is the critical point. And I tell people, I didn't realize when I was writing this book, I was writing about modern events, about contemporary events. He says, look, I opposed the Constitution. I told you not to ratify it. I warned you the government was going to become too powerful. But I didn't, but we, the people, accepted it. And if you oppose this, if you oppose the Alien and Sedition Acts, you go to the ballot box. And he warns, and again, I'm paraphrasing, but he very expressly says, if we cannot live within the Constitution that we accepted, I didn't accept it, I dissented, but we accepted it, we'll have a monarchy. Because that's the only choice. If we can't live within the government that we've created and deal with it in a constitutional way, his phrase, we're going to have a monarchy. So I think Jefferson, we haven't talked about why they personally dislike each other. Jefferson hates Henry. He can't admit that Henry's right. But the Aurora, for example, immediately the Jeffersonian newspaper in Philadelphia, the Democratic Republican newspaper.
And not just any newspaper.
No, this is the Jeffersonian voice in the press, viciously attacks Henry. He's senile, he's jealous of Jefferson. It's because they realize he has said, look, Jefferson and Madison went too far. we can't do this. We have to, that nullification is not consistent with the Constitution, and we have to act in a constitutional way.
So John,
Does.
as you and I know, certainly everybody listening to this program, watching this program knows, the great takeaway from 1800, 1801 is the peaceful transfer of power. And I never thought, I'm not, I am at a relatively senior age. I never thought in my lifetime I'd live in a moment when the idea that the peaceful transfer of power itself as an American custom, practice, tradition, value would be called into question. So it goes to, I think, what my well-being kind of last, major topic is, how do we think? So Henry and Washington don't survive to see the election of 1800, but the legacy of the events of 1798 is to make sense of what happened in 1800, 1801. So are you implying that just one thing I'm not sure that had Henry been alive, had Henry had been in better health or longer, are you implying there might have been a different outcome in 1800, 1801, or
Absolutely.
or you do?
Absolutely.
And what's your basis for
But
saying?
let's, and it's ironic because it's because of his death that we get that Jefferson wins and we get a Jeffersonian republic. And as I said, I think Jefferson and Madison really pull back. They realized they'd gone too far. But what's the basis for that? John Randolph of Roanoke, who people may be familiar with, he is a Jeffersonian. He's important legislature. His first political campaign starts that day, March 4th, 1799, at Charlotte Courthouse. He's running for Congress, and it's his first campaign. And he stands up to, by the way, he's one of the sources for the speech. He writes down contemporaneously Henry's comments. Mm-hmm. And Randolph says, if Henry had won, Jefferson would have lost. What's happening, and this will sound fascinating to people, modern, they're manipulating the Electoral College.
Yeah, I've written about this extensively. So yeah.
Because nobody, the Electoral College, nobody really understood what it was or how it was going to work, and people were realizing by the end of the 1790s that it's open to manipulation in the sense that you could do a winner take all. And Madison says that's not what we meant. That's not what we meant. We thought that there was going to be election of electors by districts. Right. So just like Virginia's congressional delegation might have 12 Federalists and 8 Republicans, or the other way around, you have a split vote. The states realized we can increase our influence by having a winner-take-all system. And so
it's not quite that simple, but go ahead.
Right? No, you're right. I mean, there's a lot of complexity, but Virginia had been using a district system basically in 1796, in 1788, and 1792, 1796. And other states, Massachusetts, for example, is switching to a winner-take-all system. And so Virginia, so Virginia, in that fall, after Henry dies, the election, March is his speech. The election is at the end of March, I think the beginning of April. He dies in June. The legislature meets in October, and they adopt a winner-take-all system. But it's close. It's by about 5 votes. And that's why Randolph says if Henry had been there, because everybody,
it's 5 votes in the legislature.
In the legislature,
right? Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah, and everybody understood that we're adopting winner take all to make Jefferson president. I mean, everybody understood that Jefferson was going to be the leading candidate in Virginia, and if Virginia had not done that, and if Henry now, who knows? We're crystal balling things. My advisor would admonish me to, not crystal ball too much. Because there are a couple things that would have to happen. Virginia would have to continue to have the district system. Does Henry influence the vote in Virginia, in Kentucky, in North Carolina? He's enormously popular in North Carolina and Kentucky. And we also only need 5 votes in the Electoral College. So it's 5 votes both in the Virginia legislature. And then we forget, Jefferson did not win by a landslide. In 1800, he wins by a landslide in 1804, but it would only have taken 5 votes in the 1800 election, and we don't.
I'm going to interject a couple comments here because it's something I've written about. I've written a lot on the Electoral College, so let me just tell our listeners. So, in 1796, I think the Virginians lost 1 district based on Richmond, and John Marshall's influence. Charles Pinckney from South Carolina writes Madison and says, maybe you guys ought to shift the rules. So that produced the result in the Virginia legislature, which I'd forgotten, but you're right. So it's a 5-vote victory to go for a winner-take-all statewide vote, which is now, of course, the norm, with the exceptions of Maine and Nebraska in American politics. But at that point, the Massachusetts legislature sees what's happening. And what they do is, Massachusetts had a district system, and there were a few districts that probably would have gone for Jefferson. I think up on the North Shore, one example.
In the Berkshires.
And yeah, in the Berkshires. So Massachusetts goes, they don't go to statewide elections. They say the legislature will appoint the electors. Pennsylvania is close to sitting the election out. And then in the end, they strike a deal where I think the Republicans get a 1-vote majority, although, and then New York is the most interesting case, because in New York, thanks to Aaron Burr, the Republicans captured the state legislature. At this point, Hamilton writes Governor John Jay, who's the governor, says, I want you to call the legislature back into, it'd be a good idea to call the legislature back into a special session, because in New York, the legislature would appoint the electors. Hamilton wants Jay to call the Federalist legislature into a lame duck session so they can create a district system and harvest a few votes. And there are a couple other there's a big dispute in Maryland on this. So John, just to kind of come back to you, and I think also because our listeners should find this interesting. So the net result is that people are embarrassed about having to do this. There's a big debate in Maryland, which also helps. It's really, is this the right thing? They said, well, we're just going to do it this one time, then we'll go back to the prior rule. I mean, the key thing to know, and it's relevant to where we are today, because we're not wholly sure what red state legislatures might do in some cases. But I think the flip side of this, and this is where I have problems with the argument, is that if you look at the congressional, well, because it gets tied in with how important was the 3/5 clause in terms of giving Jefferson his victory. I said, well, you can't just say the 3/5 clause when all the other rules are changing, right? So it's not that there's one norm for choosing presidential electors. There are a bunch of norms, a bunch of rules. But the second thing is, if you look at the congressional elections, the Republicans do so well. So it seems to me the congressional elections are the best index to what, quote unquote, the American people as a people wanted.
Yeah, I think no, Jack, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think there's a couple things here. People should understand that they're manipulating the Electoral College at that time, and they're trying to figure it out. Right. Do we know that if Henry had lived, Jefferson would have lost? No, because as you say, they do have a blowout in the congressional elections in Virginia. However, keep in mind, in the previous congressional elections, John Marshall had won because Henry supported him. Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee had won because Henry had supported him. And Jefferson's outraged. He said, how did those people ever get elected to Congress? John Marshall, because Patrick Henry supports him, gets elected to Congress, becomes Secretary of State for a moment, and then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I always have wondered whether Jefferson, when he's criticizing Marshall for the next 27 years, remembers that it's Patrick Henry's fault. The guy got elected. So no, you can't prove it. But what made me comfortable, I say in the book, my view is Jefferson would have lost. What made me comfortable with that was John Randolph, who, when he comes out and says, oh yeah, Jefferson would have lost if Henry had lived. And there are other people as well, but Randolph is the best known.
So John, we have a question from one viewer who said, which I think you can answer this one in a short sentence. First question, did Henry have presidential aspirations?
No. Is the simple answer. Which is another difference. We were talking about Henry and Jefferson. Henry really, and I don't want to be too glorifying Henry, but he does step back. I mean, he's accused. People say, well, you came out against Jefferson. You in Washington came out against Jefferson because you're jealous. You're jealous that he's going to be president. And, Henry had turned down Secretary of State. He had turned down Supreme Court Justice. He had turned down Senator. He had turned down Ambassador. He does not save his papers the way Jefferson and Washington and Adams are all very much, making sure. Jefferson cares a lot about what you and I think about him. Madison cares a lot about what you and I are going to think about him 200 years later. They're preserving their papers. Washington is preserving their papers. Henry doesn't preserve his papers.
Yeah, but John, had Henry been an extensive correspondent, and my sense is there aren't many Henry papers, but they're also the recipients who
Right.
keep the letters they receive. No.
Yeah. And he does not correspond anything like Jefferson. We have 19,000 Jefferson letters.
Right.
Even if we had all the Henry letters, it'd be a small fraction of that. But my point is, to the question, does Henry have? No, Henry is not. He really, again, it's that everyman, especially by that point in his life, he really is worried about his family. And he's trying to provide for these 17 children. I think, again, remarkable for that time. I think 16 or 15 or 16 of them outlive him because, of course, you had a high mortality rate.
Jefferson. I always said Jefferson, Madison. I think often. I mean, I thought they complained that. I mean, Henry was highly influential, but also lazy. Yes, and that he didn't. I mean, Madison lives for a political life. Jefferson kind of waxes and wanes, but I think after Martha dies and once he gets re-involved in politics, he gets involved at 120%. But Henry, maybe the point about having all these kids is for perfectly good reasons was his main distraction. I mean, George Mason was the same way.
Yeah, he's busy. But no, I think Jefferson overdoes it with the laziness. Now, undoubtedly, and even Henry's family says, look, he's not like Madison. I mean, Madison loves this stuff. Nothing better than Madison. I've been in his library at Montpelier. He wants to lock himself in the library for 3 weeks at a time and read every book and come up, well, what's the Greek translation of that? No, Henry's very much interested in, I'm going to go hunting. I'm going to go fishing. I got kids. He apparently makes up songs. He plays the violin. He plays the fiddle. And he plays the flute, and he would make up songs for his grandchildren, and then he would crumble them up and throw them in the fireplace. And so he's not as fixated as either Madison or Jefferson, but he's not lazy. He's accused of laziness by Jefferson, but that's just not really fair.
Yeah. Well, I hope we have other questions. None are pending. If there are any viewers out there who want to press us on any particular points, now is the moment to send something in using the chat function. Let me just ask maybe one last question. I mean, it does seem to me that, and you alluded to this earlier, the legacy, tracing the legacy of 1798 is complicated. I mean, Jefferson, as many political acts are calculated for their short-term effects. And I think the history of, what's called the spirit of 1798 becomes, in a sense, an independent variable of its own. I mean, people, in the future, acting in the future, meaning post-1800, will look back to it and seize on it as a convenient symbol and carry it in directions or, to depths that, neither Madison nor Jefferson would have welcomed. So I see that's one complicated aspect of the, of the story that needs to be kept in mind.
Well, and I don't think you mentioned, I mean, the spirit of 98, I think people are returning to it today. Some people, the 3%ers and some of these more extreme conservative groups, the idea of the states are independent, the states are sovereign, the states can control the federal government by nullifying federal laws. I mean, the stuff that was happening out west on the lands where, people were taking over national parks, that was nullification. They were saying that we in Oregon can ignore federal law if we think it's unconstitutional or a violation. So as you say, that spirit of 98, which is a reference to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798, written by Jefferson and Madison, took on a life of its own after 1800 and continues today. I guess two thoughts. One, which we haven't talked about much, is it also becomes the embodiment of the protection of slavery. It's the spirit of 98 becomes the justification, nullification, states' rights. I don't think, in fairness to Jefferson and Madison, that that's how they saw it. Slavery was just not the issue in 1798. Nobody thought slavery was going to be done away with. They weren't worried about it being done away with. But as you mentioned, people seize upon that Virginia and Kentucky resolutions then, and it becomes the great defense of slavery in the antebellum period. The Fire Eaters, South Carolina, Calhoun, they're all quoting Jefferson and Madison. The other thing that I think is interesting is that, as I said, Madison, I think, is pulling back almost immediately and realizing this goes too far. And for the rest of his life, and he lives, what, 1836, I believe?
June 28th, 1836.
So for the rest of his life, he's saying that's not what we meant. It's not nullification. States can't do this. You're going to destroy the Union. Jefferson actually vacillates a little bit. And, you know, Jefferson, I do think he pulled way back during his presidency. I think he realized it went too far. You get into the Missouri crisis. So this is one of the problems we have when we talk about the founders. We act as if we read as if they're a marble statue. Jefferson thought this way, or Madison thought this way. Jefferson certainly changes over time, and his thinking develops over time. As I said, I think he pulls way back in his presidency. He's been accused for 200 years of hypocrisy. I don't think it was hypocrisy. I think he realized some of the stuff we were saying in the 1790s, we can't do that. That was hyper partisan. We can't do that. I think the Missouri crisis, 1820, when he's talking about, you know, the fire bell in the night, we have the wolf by the ears. It's neither safe to hold on nor to let go. He reverts to a much more radical states' rights view. And Madison, you know, and I only came upon this fairly recently. You might be familiar with it. I think it's 1825, where the federal government is talking about implementing infrastructure. And Jefferson and Madison believed that was unconstitutional. And so Jefferson has this sort of crazy idea. He says, well, if we're not going to stand up to the federal government and we're not going to nullify, what we ought to do in Virginia is whenever the federal government passes an unconstitutional law, like infrastructure, we should have the Virginia legislature pass the identical law in Virginia. And that way, our people would be abiding by the constitutional Virginia law, not that unconstitutional federal law. And it's crazy. And Madison writes in this lovely letter, sort of says, you know, he doesn't quite say, Tom, you're crazy. But if you're reading it, he's saying, Tom, you're crazy. You can't do that. That's a nutty idea. But it's, I think it's an indication of Jefferson gets back into that more radical states' rights idea that Madison spends the rest of his life trying to downplay.
And actually, we have one last question has come in, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Okay.
So the last question is: do you think part of the reason Patrick Henry is not as well known is the lack of his letters, or because his political shift didn't lend itself well to the Confederate mindset?
I think it's some of both. I think the lack of letters, the fact that he did not accept the federal position, the fact that he was a loser on the Constitution, he was an anti-Federalist. So I think there's a lot of reasons why we don't remember Patrick Henry as well as we might. But the question, I think their last point is absolutely valid. I think Henry dies in 1799. Jefferson dies in 1826. Jefferson spends 27 years trashing Patrick Henry. You know, Daniel Webster, as a young politician, comes to visit Jefferson at Monticello. I think it was 1822, 1823. Jefferson goes on and on about Henry was stupid. He was a bad lawyer. He couldn't write. He didn't read. Crazy stuff. He says George Wythe refused to sign his law license, which is not true. We have found a copy of Henry's law license signed by George Wythe. But as your question implies, he does then come out on the wrong side of the Confederacy. And that's why I said when we started that Edward Pollard, the great apologist for the Confederacy, the author of The Lost Cause, absolutely despises Patrick Henry because of his 1799 campaign. And so Henry, in Virginia, he loses his luster because of the 1799 campaign.
Well, John, thanks so much. This has been a fun hour for me. Obviously, I'm going to have to give a little as a dyed-in-the-wool Madisonian, I'm going to have to go a measure of reconsideration to Henry's. I did give the Patrick Henry lecture at Johns Hopkins once, and we actually there's a Henry descendant in the audience, and I couldn't overlook quoting Jefferson's line, what we have to do is hope for Patrick Henry's death.
Devoutly pray. It's devoutly pray for his death. Yeah.
But it's it's been a lot of fun chatting with you, and I hope all our viewers and listeners out there had as much fun doing this as I've had joining in it. So that's a wrap from here, and thanks to all of you for listening. And John, great to be in touch with you.
Thank you, Jack.